I'll show you how to rebuild your hydraulic pump on your Ford 600 through 900 tractor, as well as the early 2000 and 4000 4-cylinders. They're pretty simple, not much to them. You don't need any kind of special tools. Just basically take it apart, change a few gaskets, a couple bearings if you need to, and a seal. Make sure all your springs and your balls are good. Put her back together. Alright, let's get to it. Alright, first thing you're going to do is take off your proof meter drive adapter. It's a 1-inch wrench. Just unscrew this little nut adapter. Okay, and on this adapter, this is your first gasket right here that you're going to change. And you have your drive that your proof meter cable goes into. And there's also a bolt down here. This is slided into. That actually drives it. Now, one on mine is stripped out, so I'm able to turn it with just a flathead screwdriver. And so just reach in here with the magnet, pull it out. There's also another washer behind your lock washer. Okay, so now we're ready to take off this piece of the housing. These 4 9/16 head bolts. Now once you start taking your last bolt loose, this housing is going to try to come off because all of your pistons in here are pushing against it with spring pressure. So just be aware of that. You can see it split right there. Okay. Now, when you lift this off, reach in here. You're going to grab your drive shaft here, because if not, it will fall out. Okay. Well, while I got this out, there's an O-ring here that's your seal, so make sure this surface is good and clean when you put it back. What you're going to do now is you can go ahead and pull this shaft out. So here's your first bearing. You don't have to change this, but I kind of recommend it because you're in here anyway. You can buy a bearing pretty cheap. There's a little bit better shot of the race for your tapered roller bearing. And here's your seal. Once again, with the lip of the seal facing towards pressure. Although I believe this one is a double lip seal, so you got one lip this way and one lip that way. I can show it better once I actually get it apart. And here's your needle bearing down in there. There it is. Just make sure it's good, spins freely, you know, not damaged. You can also tell by your shaft how wore out that bearing is. And also don't forget to take your gear out. And once I get this seal out, I'll clean this bearing up really well. We'll get this piece sandblasted and painted and be ready for reassembly. This here is 2 pieces. You got your thrust bearing and your other race. Now in here, these are your actual pistons. Each one will move and pumps fluid. These just slide out, at least they should. When you buy a rebuild kit, you will usually get new springs if you opt for the bigger kit. You can also buy pistons, but if they're not worn, I wouldn't even bother changing. Okay, so that's all we got in this side for now. So I'll flip her over. Take this side off. And these bolts are longer than the other side, plus you have 6 versus 4, so you pretty much can't screw it up. Now, they usually won't come off that easy. I've already had this one apart to inspect it. You'll probably have to tap this with a hammer. Just lightly tap it and it should break free. The reason being, you have this gasket here, which is going to break, you know, obviously. Go ahead and get these out of here. Okay. This part is clean the gasket up, change the O-ring, sandblast it, prime it, paint it, ready for assembly. Get this out. Take out number 3 Phillips here. And right here, there's a little notch cut into this. I say mine comes out easy because I already took it apart. But you're basically going to stick here and just pry this out. And it's going to be tough, but it will pop out. So there's your plate with gaskets on both sides. 6 more balls. Get them off. Then there's all these little springs in here. There are these little, they look almost like roll pins down here. Just inspect them, make sure that they're not damaged in any way. I think these can be replaced, but I'm not sure. But mine all look good, so we're not going to mess with them. We'll just clean everything up, sandblast it, and get it ready for assembly. And that's pretty much it for the disassembly process. Okay, so a little bit of information is going on right here right now. As you can see, this pump's been repainted already. And the reason being, this pump was already put together once before and ran on the tractor. I actually mentioned that in my teardown video. However, whenever I went back to look at the film to edit this video to put it out there for you guys, you couldn't see anything I was doing in here, and it was just horrible. So I decided to tear this back apart for you and show a better video of how you put this together. So stuff's going to change here or there, you know, like maybe the colors and whatnot, maybe the audio, maybe the visuals, but it's the same pump. It's all just to try to get you guys some better content. So with that out of the way, let's get going. Alright, the first part we're going to work on is going to be the head of the pump. First thing we need to do is put in these 6 springs. Now there's multiple springs in your kit, so be sure you get the right ones. These are a thin wire spring, approximately 3/4 inches long. And they're going to go into these middle 6 holes. The next part to go in is going to be the check balls. There's 12 balls total, and they're all the same. So we're just going to take 6 of them and put them here into the center, on top of our springs. The next piece we're going to put on is going to be a gasket. And you have 2 gaskets that come with your kit, maybe even 3. If you have 3, you're going to have another one of these. You'll have to find the correct one. But for right now, we want the one that just has holes in the center, not these oblong shapes. If you look at your gasket, and even the pressure plate, there is a little notch cut in it. Those notches need to line up. And that notch is going to point to this stud. So go ahead and set your gasket down in and line your holes up. Now the pressure plate itself has another 6 springs that are kind of conical shaped. If you look at the end of the conical shape, there's a tight wires where the taper is for the cone. And that's going to go onto each of these little studs here. And be sure you press that spring all the way down onto that stud. And like you see, I've already got the other ones on here. This plate is going to go into the head with these springs facing up. So go ahead and set it down in there. Take your center screw, set it down in there, and thread it in. Now take a couple of bolts and put them in here to line up your plate. We're going to go ahead and tighten down our center screw. And just so it does not come loose, we're going to lightly tap it with an impact driver. So that screw should not back out now. So there's the pressure plate and head assembly complete. I'm going to set that off to the side. We're going to bring the main body over. Now the main body has some seats in here that you may have to change if they're damaged. Mine are not. I'm not changing them. So we're going to take our other 6 balls, drop them into the holes on these outer edges over these seats. Then we're going to take our head assembly again and put our gasket on it. Make sure everything's lined up. Now we're going to take the head, we're going to stick it onto the main body, making sure all of our springs line up on those balls. Now we're going to take the 6 longest screws, or bolts rather. We're going to go ahead and bolt them down. And then these are going to get torqued to, I believe, 45 foot-pounds. And when you torque them down, torque them in a crisscross pattern. And I'm going to set mine up in a vise to torque them down. Alright, so the next parts to put in is going to be our pistons themselves. Make sure you get the correct springs. This is where you're going to have different springs depending on your pumps. So be sure you get the right wire diameter and size. On your pistons, make sure they're not scratched up or anything. When you go to stick them into your bore, be sure your bores are good and clean and that these pistons slide nice and easily in. And always give them just a little plunge to make sure they return back. And just coat them with a little bit of hydraulic oil before you put them in. I'm just adding a little bit of lube right here on the face level, so the wobble plate has something there to lubricate it before hydraulic oil gets up to it. So the next thing, we're going to go ahead and stick our O-ring right here into the groove. Alright, so let's set this to the side for a second. Alright, so right now I'm going to transition back to my old video to show you guys how you install the wobble plate bearing, as well as showing you guys how you change the seal, this bearing race. And I don't think I changed the needle bearing, but if you need to change the needle bearing, it just slides in and out once you get the seal and the race out. First thing I'm going to do is change this bearing. Now there's no way for me to get underneath this bearing and put a splitter underneath it. So there's two ways I can go about doing this. Both of them involve cutting the cage. You cut the cage off, get the rollers out. And then I can try and put a splitter underneath this upper lip and pull it off. If that works, great. If not, the next option is to take a cutoff wheel and cut a groove into the bearing, the inner race. And then I'll have to take a chisel to it, like a cold chisel, and hit it. And that will crack this race, and then the race will just fall right off. So let's cut this cage off. Usually you can do this with a good pair of diagonal cutters, but all I've got is a cheap pair of Harbor Freight, so we'll see how that works. So I got that loose. Okay, now we have those bottom two cut and the rollers removed. And there's the upper one cut. Okay, so now we got all the rollers going. Now, this is nothing special. This is just a 20-ton press. It does pretty much anything that you will need on a tractor and most stuff on cars. Okay, so that worked great. Got our race out off of the shaft. Okay, here's my new bearing. It's a Timken bearing. I prefer Timkens because they're made in the US. The one you need for the pump is a set 6. This has both the bearing cone and the race that goes up into the cast part. Take my old race. See, now I got a perfect press point. So what we're going to do, we're going to take this, flip it upside down, and line everything up. Even though this shaft looks bent, it's actually perfectly straight up and down. You can see that as I spin it. See there, it looks kind of bent. But this flat is perfectly square to the shaft. So that's why we're going to press here. And we'll press it on. And these should go fairly easy. If they don't go easy, you need to stop. And you're going to press it down until it fully seats where you don't see light through it. And you'll feel resistance. Then just hit it a little more and you're good. You see, and the other race will fall right off. So now we got a new bearing on our wobble shaft. One thing you need to inspect before you press this bearing on, make sure that this part of the shaft is not grooved or damaged. Or if the shaft is grooved or damaged, it's not going to seal and you're not going to get a good prime on your pump. Like I do have a little groove right here on the fingernail, but I don't think it's enough to cause any issues. Now, the way the service manual tells you to do this step, is to clamp this in a vise and use a slide hammer to pull the race out. Now when I did that on my other tractor, I ended up shattering this piece, and I had to buy this whole assembly. And it was about $170, and that was 8 years ago. So I don't want to do that again. So see if we can figure out a way to get this out of here. Okay, I said I didn't want to, pull this with a slide hammer because of what happened last time. So what I rigged up is actually a clutch pilot bearing puller, but it doesn't open wide enough to fit the race. So this bolt here in the center is actually wedged between the two jaws to spread them out. And then of course, this is actually pushing down on the housing while this lifts up. It's actually working pretty good, and hopefully nothing will get destroyed. Only problem is the bolt don't stay. But the bearing is coming out, so that's the important part. Because I can reset it a couple of times, that's no issue. There we go. Success. And no broken housing this time. Okay, to get this seal out, I took these two big lag screws and I drilled into my seal, and I drilled it because there's a piece of metal in there, and these are pretty big. And what I did was I drilled in this little channel. That way I have no chance of tearing up my outer surface where this seals. And I put these two bolts in here. Now I'm prying it up. Probably could use a puller on this and get it a lot easier, but this is working. See? It's just difficult to get it to break free. See, now if you was going to change this needle bearing, you could either use the clutch puller, pilot bearing puller, or you could even go from the back and just knock it out with a punch. But mine's in good condition, so I'm not changing it. So now I got to put my new seal in and my new race. This seal's a double lip, doesn't matter which way it goes in. Okay, so seal goes in. This is actually the race. No, this ain't the race we took off. This is actually a different race that I have. That's a spare one. And I'm going to put this aluminum piece on there just to act as a good flat surface to knock this in. I'm going to seat this seal in. Okay, I got that seal in there flush. So that's what it looks like. Just make sure it's flush around that outer lip. Now we're going to put the bearing race in. This is actually the correct driver for this race, so I'll be able to use it all the way. I'm just going to drive this racing. And then here, when you hear it change pitch, it's seated. So there's our new race installed. Alright, so the next thing we're going to work on is going to be the drive housing itself. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to stick the gear in there. This gear is double-sided, or has two different sides rather. The dished side is going to face towards your proof meter drive. Take your wobble shaft, put a little bit of assembly lube or your hydraulic oil or even engine oil onto the seal mating or seal surface there. Slide that up into the housing and spline it with the shaft, or spline it with the gear rather. Next thing is going to be our washer, which mine's like really wallered out from where my bolt was broken. I'm going to put a lock washer in the bolt. Stick that down in there and tighten that up. I do not believe there's a torque spec on that, but it's a 1/4 inch bolt, so it's probably only going to be about 10 foot-pounds. So do not tighten it very tight. Just give everything a good test spin. Make sure you push your wobble plate up into your bearing. Things seems good. Now we'll bring the pump body over. We're going to install our thrust plate and our Torrington bearing on top of our pistons. And then we're going to take our drive housing, line up our wobble plate into the bearings, and then we'll get our bolts put in. And you will have to push this down because of the wobble plate to get your bolts started. And get all of your bolts started before you start tightening them. Okay, and once again, these bolts torque down to 45 foot-pounds. However, it's hard to get a ratchet straight on here, so you may have to use a crow foot or just a wrench and tighten them down pretty good and snug. Okay, just give it a spin check. And you should be able to hear it pumping. So our last part to install is going to be our proof meter drive. There's a slot that goes into the slot into the bolt. We got our gasket that goes on our little drive adapter, and that's just going to screw down. And you can just snug that up. Alright, so there's the hydraulic pump rebuilt. Now it's time to ready to put it back on the tractor. So we're getting ready to put the hydraulic pump back onto the tractor. There's a couple things here that you're going to have to pay attention to. You're going to need a gasket right here over your camshaft, and you're going to need 2 O-rings on your manifold. These O-rings on this manifold are square cut O-rings. Be sure to use square cut O-rings. If you don't, this will leak. You should be able to get these O-rings probably from New Holland dealer or a tractor parts distributor. You can also purchase a gasket, or you can make a gasket. So I got the pump. I'm going to just go ahead and just put the O-rings into the pump. This larger O-ring here on your suction side doesn't fit snug like the pressure side. So be careful that this one does not fall out and get caught under your pump when you stick it on. And if it does fall out and get stuck, just move it before you bolt it down. And we'll take and slide the gasket on the pump as well. Line up the studs and drop it in. And my O-ring fell out. I just lifted up the pump and it fell right into place. Down here on your studs on your manifold, you're going to get a flat washer and a nut. And be sure you use a pretty thick washer, because these holes are kind of large. If you use a small one, they will deform. On these nuts, you're going to torque them to 45 foot-pounds. Back here on the back, just line your gasket up, put in your bolts with the new lock washer, and these bolts will torque down to about 25 because they're only a 3/8 bolt. So I'm going to tighten these up here first, and bear in mind that this manifold is aluminum. Alright, so there's the pump installed on the tractor. Now, I'm still way away from starting my tractor. However, if your tractor is running, you can pull this plug out and you can crank your tractor over. Like, don't start it, but just crank it over, and this should start to pull hydraulic fluid up out of here. Once fluid starts coming out of here, your pump is primed. So then cap this plug off, start your tractor, and your pump should start working. But that's it for now. Thanks for watching.